here to introduce now Dr. Laura Bruckman, who's going to be giving the first technical talk of the day. She's an associate professor in the Department of Material Sciences and Engineering at Case Western Reserve University. Her research is focused on using data science approaches to material degradation, and she's an expert in leveraging quantitative spectroscopic techniques and imaging analysis to understand how material degrades under different stress conditions. And her research has applications in solar packaging materials, building envelope materials, coatings, and additively manufactured materials. She also teaches in the Applied Data Science program at Case Western with a focus on visualization and analytics and research projects and communicating the results to different types of audiences. And today she's going to talk to us about materials data science approach for reliability and how to go from materials to systems. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Bruckman.
Okay. So I have a slide a little bit about myself. I always, in these kind of circumstances and talks, I like to give a little background, just like our previous speaker. It was very nice. So I actually have a PhD in chemistry. I really loved chemistry. I hated organic chemistry. I think that that's true. So, I don't know. I really enjoyed physical chemistry. So, but I got my PhD in chemistry in South Carolina, and but I will also say that I had a very similar experience. In high school, I was told by my guidance counselor, well, you're really smart, but we don't think you'll amount to much. So I don't think you should set your sights on becoming a chemist. It was very nice to go back to high school and let them all know about my PhD in chemistry. So this was in the 2000s, so it's a little sad. So for my PhD, I built 2 instruments. And when I built 2 instruments, I basically had to develop techniques in order to understand that those instruments were working appropriately. And in that, I basically taught myself data science at the time. I had basically taken one computer science class. I had a very similar experience. I entered that computer science class. Everyone was leaps and bounds ahead of me. I did not understand what they were talking about. I had no idea what access to things looked like. And I had to get a tutor in almost. I went to my graduate class and I taught myself how to program. I taught myself machine learning. I taught myself image analysis. I taught myself classification. But basically, I had a problem to solve and I really liked puzzles. And so I basically figured out how to do it. So now I'm an associate professor in material science and engineering, and I'm focusing on geophysics. I also am a co-director of the Department of Energy and NSA Center of Excellence. I work with Lawrence Livermore and as part of that, and this is on materials data science for stockpile stewardship. I'm also director of an NSF industry university consortium on data science for reliability around materials. I also work with high school students through American Chemical Society, bring them in, and basically we work on teaching data science to these high school students when they come in around chemistry. I'm also I'm deputy task manager for photovoltaic power systems for International Energy Agency, looking at the reliability of PV systems. And I'm also part of the United Nations Environmental Program, the environmental effects part of the Montreal program to look at how the ozone changes and how that might impact materials degradation here on Earth and how we can particularly plan for that. And so then I am also part of the applied data science minor that's at Case. I'll talk about that in a second. And I also teach in the computer and data science department. So I am a bit interdisciplinary. And I've helped develop this applied data science minor here at Case, which is a unique thing. It goes across the whole university. So when we teach this, we have students from engineering, we have students from the social justice department, we have students from medicine, biology, from business, and they all come together and they're learning data science from the perspective of a domain expert. And then how do I start learning stats, computer science, data science to apply to my problem instead of from the perspective of a computer scientist learning a theoretical part. And I have been developing data visualization and analytics because I got very frustrated that so many students were never looking at their data. And that was a pet peeve of mine. And then I'm also starting to develop how to visualize data with a HoloLens, so we can do virtual reality or mixed reality visualization of complex data sets. So first, I'd like to acknowledge my group. So we have a very large group with the Center of Excellence in multiple faculty. So I really appreciate the students who are definitely part of this. So one thing on materials reliability is it's very hard, and a big, large problem that we're seeing out there is we need materials to live a long time outdoors, and we see failures all the time basically happening where we put materials outdoors, and it's very hard to predict what's going to happen to them in, say, a situation such as, in this case, what happens to them in the desert, what happens to them in Florida, what happens to them in a place like Japan. And we have all these different climate zones, what happens to them in Alaska, and how do we understand those climatic stressors with materials that have very different properties. Often these are commercial products where you don't even know how the company is manufacturing them. Company A is manufacturing a material very different than company B and still calling it polyester. And so this takes a difference of how we've been doing accelerated exposures, how reliability is being done, which is often has been value pass or fail. I put a material outside or I put in an accelerated testing situation and it passed, so now I know what's happening. Really, we don't have any understanding of what the material is done. So the change here is we need to look at the data from a data-centric idea. So oftentimes in material science, it has been thought of I'm going to study one material very minutely and really get a good understanding of that particular material and then publish a paper on it, which is fine. But if we think about reliability, we need to understand the population of a material because that's how you actually know if I paint a building here in California and I paint a building in Ohio and I paint a building in Florida, I need to know that that building is going to last 10, 15, 20 years. I need to know about that building, say, 1,000 times that paint is going in that building. So I need to have significant more information. And we're generally getting a lot more data out there now. And so we need to start thinking about data and how we handle data in order to do materials data science. So one thing my lab has started about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, is we developed CRADL, which is this common research analytics and data lifecycle environment. And the idea here is that we wanted to be able to handle and ingest data at large scales effectively and relatively easy so that people in material science, people in chemistry can do this as well as people in computer science so that it kind of across the board even this out so an interdisciplinary team can do this. So we're able to ingest basically 27 billion rows of PV power data minute by minute. We have over 100,000 sites of PV power data that we're bringing in minute by minute, and we can bring that in. We can look at 45 million high-speed camera images and adjust that and put it in place and be able to track this in our infrastructure. One of the reasons we can do that is because we vertically scale our computing infrastructure and high-performance computing, but we're also horizontally scaling so that we can do distributed computing. And the idea here is we're prioritizing scientific data workflows, as well as looking at open source technology and looking at doing heterogeneous data. So we know we're going to get heterogeneous data there. Another thing we did is we wanted to make certain that we can have accessibility for our computing. So over here, you don't need to read it, but this is all of the code that used to be for any of the students who get on our high performance computing cluster. So now what you see over here is that they're just clickable buttons. So we changed this infrastructure so that any person can say, I want to use RStudio server, I want to get on a Jupyter notebook or a code server, and you just click a button and you can actually request how many nodes, how much power you need. And this really revolutionized how easy it was for people to actually access this. And so now my students can't say, I couldn't get on the high performance computing cluster and run my code. It is actually easily able to be done. So I teach freshmen. I had 2 classes of freshmen, computer science majors and engineering majors. Within 2 classes, everyone was up running, had Git repositories and running on high performance computing in class. So the next part of this is we really want to think about, in a data-centric idea, is we want our data ready for doing artificial intelligence. If we want to do materials data science, and we want to think about it in that way, you really want to plan your studies, plan your data to eventually do artificial intelligence or machine learning or modeling. It becomes problematic if you kind of just set out and do an experiment and say, I'm going to study this experiment and not really plan for the future of what models do you want to do, what kind of artificial intelligence do you potentially want to do in the future, because then you end up with not enough data. And then you're trying to pigeonhole your data into some sort of model that does not work. So in this case, we're really focusing on FAIR and ontologies. So FAIR is making sure your data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this goes for data, metadata, which is very important and very problematic to get people to actually record, and also for models. So if you build a model, you should be recording all of the information of how you built that model. What data did you train it on? What version of the model was it? Everything about that model. And then you should write your results in your model back so that you can actually retrieve all those model results. So if you think about it, traditionally, you prepare a sample, you get all your instruments set up, you write it down in some notebook, you keep your results, you analyze it, and you publish a paper. What happens is no one can repeat your results. We definitely have students 2 years later, they can't figure out what someone did. No one wrote it down. Everyone is extremely frustrated. And you basically lose that historical reference of what has happened. It becomes expensive for people to repeat, and you're simply repeating results. So what we wanted to focus on is how not to do that. So if you think about your data, you'll record it in some spreadsheet. This is about temperature, right? So 2 years later, that person left. How do you know what temp is? Well, yes, it's temperature, but is it Celsius, Fahrenheit, Kelvin? What is it? Where was the data recorded? Is this month, date, year? Is it month, year, date? You start asking these questions. You can annotate it, but computers can't necessarily read your annotations. I don't know how many spreadsheets I've gotten where they're colored. There's some color metric that is supposed to help you in the future. So this gets lost and is not reusable. So we've developed this FAIR materials package. It's in Python and R. And the idea, so I'll talk about it on the next slide. Our FAIR materials package also starts allowing us to work with ontology. So an ontology is a formal dictionary, and it basically adds words to data. And this is helpful because you can start adding knowledge to your data. It's important because humans interact with words. We like words. It allows to add information there. And so what this allows us to say is a power plant, so a PV power plant, has a latitude, and it gives you the latitude. It gives a connection and a bridge between what our data is and gives it a verb. And this allows you to basically take unstructured data and give it an ontology so you can link information together. And this allows you to go from data to information to knowledge a little bit easier. And there's actually ontologies out there that have standards around them. There's BFO, which is a high level ontology, and there's PMD Co, which is a material science ontology. So you can use standard ontologies and don't have to mix things up. So in our case, our fair materials package basically brings in raw data from collaborators. In this case, we ingest it in Cradle, and then we verify it. We basically bring in a CSV with our metadata. We map it with a schema. We make JSON LDs. We add our ontology, and then we bring out JSONs, which have unique identifiers with an ORCID ID to whoever is creating it. Your ORCID ID should always be unique, so therefore it's forever unique. And then this allows you to have several naming files that are always named so that your data is forever unique and has this scheming and matching together so that temp is clearly defined in an ontology with a naming convention. It has that it's Celsius or Fahrenheit, and it's always attached with the data. So I'll walk through quickly an example of this. So I had a project with the Department of Energy. So we're going to talk about commercial power plants. So what we did is we wanted to know, so the backside of PV modules is a commercial polymer. It is made by many different companies. The bill of materials is generally never known because they aren't told. You will go through a site and oftentimes they will switch between modules, and the owners of the modules will never know that the manufacturers of the modules switch them. And we wanted to look at the degradation of them. There is millions and millions of dollars of lawsuits on failures of backsheets right now. So this is a big deal. We went out in a field because we were retrieving modules from people and analyzing them. The problem with that is, how do you know that the backsheet you retrieved out of the field was representative of the entire field? There could be 10,000 modules in a field, and if you got one, was it really representative of the degradation in an entire field? It was probably not. So we went out in a field and we basically measured the yellowness index. Yellowness index is a pretty good proxy of degradation of a polymer in this case because it represents the formation of chromophores. And we basically measured rack length, so along the rack, and what we see is this edge effect. We did not believe this was going to happen. We were actually very surprised by this. We thought they would be all relatively uniform. And on each ends of the rows, we had much higher degradation. And this blue right here is the top row, has significantly higher yellowness index. Then we met and measured irradiance on the backside of these modules, and it relatively matched the degradation patterns, what we said. So what we saw was there was microclimates, basically, that were happening on the backside of our modules. And so we got a new project funded by the Department of Energy for 3 years. And we went out and decided to go look at fields all over the United States. We made our package to determine what was the climate zones based on different environments. And then we're making a standard because there was actually no known nomenclature about how you actually name modules in a field. No one had standardized this. So we actually decided how to name a rack, a subrow, how to name a module so that you can actually do a field survey. Everyone had just been talking about them very differently. This is my student walking through. They had a GPS tracker so we could actually talk about the modules when they were measuring them so we could track our data. And then we basically had real life examples of going through and measuring each block, each row. We came up with materials characterizations that you could do in the field. And then we decided how to name on the back side of each PV module with a certain nomenclature. And then the students went out in the field. This was all done during the pandemic, so we did not get to do as many as we would like to. But we went out to 41 sites and we did over 17,000 measurements. So this required us to A, keep good track, to verify our data. It's all available on OSF right now for shared data for anyone to use or model with. And we then we revisited some sites over time to look at the temporal variation of that data. And what you see is over time, so this is 4, 8, and 10 years of exposure, is that basically the yellowness index increased. We still saw this edge effect. This was made with polyethylene naphthalate, or polyethylene naphthalate, which is a terrible polymer to ever make a backsheet in. And what we also saw, so this is just some examples. We also saw is that on places with roads, there was actually higher irradiance yellowing on the edges, except for in this case, it was very random. We went actually back to the site and realized that they had basically replaced modules. And so it definitely changed our modeling effect, but we had to go through and talk to the sites and understand what they had done, and get their records and incorporate them. So then we had to look at all of the variants and understand everything that was happening in the field. And we basically took a package from NREL and simulated the backside rear irradiance. Irradiance was the biggest part. And we simulated what a row would look like with irradiance, with I-beams, with different architectures on the backside of the module. And we were able to look at the changes in yellowness index based on our data and different materials. One important thing you will see, so we'll quickly go over this, is that PVDF, PVF, which are pretty good fluoropolymers, you will see that there's very few changes there. They are generally made by the same company, and they're made uniformly. The biggest thing you will see is PET is made by very many different companies. PET is said to be the same thing. When we actually took it apart, you will see that PET had different stabilizer packages. Some of them had clear PET on the outside, and then a TiO2 stabilized PET on the inside. There were so many different variations of PET, and we had very different performance properties. So this is when you look at the literature and they say, I use PET. You really need to know by whom and what type of PET, because that is not enough information. And when we think about recording metadata, you really need to know a lot more than it was PET, because it's performing very differently. Yeah. And then we made a spatial temporal model, and we basically looked at the time of wetness. We had ingested all of the weather data for all of the sites, and we looked at time of wetness, elevated temperature, simulation, material, and we were able to get a pretty good model. And this is a version of the model for years of exposure, and able to predict the yellowness index of the backside of these models. The idea here is you can start identifying a canary in a coal mine. So as you go through, your models at the top and the edge of the rows are going to see the most degradation. And you might think, okay, so the yellow, biggest thing is as they yellow, they'll go to a critical point in yellowing, and then they start cracking. As they crack, they become a safety hazard. And this is where there's lawsuits. As soon as they crack, they start becoming potentially, you put your hand on the backside module and you could potentially be electrocuted. And so this is where there's concerns. There's a bunch of lawsuits. So this is where, how do you know how far they get or this cracking occurs? So this is part of this modeling. So I had one more section, but I'll stop here in the course of time. And thank you very much.
Thank you for the great presentation. So I was wondering, how does the verification framework compare to other data management softwares like Granto, or is it like compatible with them and they can merge?
Yeah, so verification is the idea of making sure your data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and usable. So it doesn't matter how you're storing your data. It's the idea of making sure you can find your data, that you're using an accessible idea, that you have the appropriate provenance. How you actually implement it is not as defined yet. So we are making this package and bringing in ontologies and making JSON LDs because that's how we feel that that is the most effective way of doing it. But the FAIR, so there is a FAIR push and there's a whole Make Data FAIR website and everything. They did not actually yet establish a whole workflow. So you can make your data FAIR and use your own database, if that makes any sense. But the idea is that you have a unique identifier that continues all the way, that it's machine readable, so it's not in some random CSV in different places, that it's readable across different types of systems, so that it's not in some proprietary software information. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I'm just wondering if everyone comes with their own definition of their data, then maybe that can be also conflicting in terms of being interpretable.
Right. So the Materials Genome Project with NIST is really trying to work on making this consistent and standard. So this is relatively a new process. So we're working with this on this too, to try to standardize this. And Europe is significantly further ahead than the United States on pushing FAIR principles. So there is groups that are putting out principles, and then it's kind of filtering down of actually how to implement this. And I think JSON LDs are the best format for sharing the actual files because they become very inefficient systems. But you could say my data is FAIR because I shared it on OSF, potentially, but it's not really if there's not a unique identifier, metadata is attached to it. If you guys really understand what I did, it's not actually FAIR. It's just that I shared something with you.
Right.
I just want to make a plug. I work for the library here at Livermore. We're happy to talk to you about metadata and open data and that kind of stuff.
I agree. Librarians have been wonderful in this.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.